This is our last instalment, the final topic of the GCSE. So at the end of paper 2, we have social stratification. Again, there is a document in the Google Classroom to support you with this, to help you make notes. Alternatively, feel free to make your own mind map, your own Google document, whichever you prefer, to help you revise. The one I've made has all the icons on to give you kind of the visual stimulus and remind you of keywords, key terms, key ideas, etc. And as always, if you need anything, please comment in the Google Classroom, email me, let me know below, and I'll do my best to help as quickly as possible. Is stratification functionally necessary in every society? Now, the word functionally has given you a clue there that we're talking about functionalism and Davis and Moore. You could take that word out of the question and just ask yourself, basically, do we need to put people into layers, into groups, into a hierarchy? So they would say it places us into roles that need to be filled. Some positions are more important than others. Some roles require more talent and skill. So you need social inequality to get society to function, to separate people into the right places, the right levels. And you can easily use the little chart on the right there to see what your beliefs are and how closely you agree with Davis and Moore or not. So what kind of status do you believe is in society? Now remember, ascribed is given to you and achieved is obviously what you achieve. Whether you believe talent is distributed equally or not, whether you earn your positions in society through talent, whether you can move in society and whether that's desirable to, and whether you have to have some inequality or not. Obviously, Davis and Moore would argue for achieved status and a yes to pretty much all of those things. Other sociologists, your functionalists, your Marxists, your conflict sociologists would argue against those. And it's quite all right to be a mix of yeses and nos. You're forming your own personal opinion there and you're evaluating who has the strongest and weakest arguments. So work through those, see what conclusions you come to, and think about that in terms of what we've talked about with Davis and Moore and social stratification. Now, wealth and income in the UK are interesting sources of debate. Wealth is how much money you have, essentially, or how much money in assets and resources too. Now you can see there from the graph how wide the distribution of wealth is, how different it is, how much wealth is concentrated towards the elite in British society. And the breakdown there of the ONS graph kind of talks to you about that. You know, the wealthiest 10% have 43% of the country's wealth, which is a huge proportion. And the bottom 50% of people in Britain only had 9% of the wealth. So that's the latest figures up until March 2020. And you may hear talk of the 1%ers or the 1%. So often this is in terms of a global context, but I think a lot of people are now applying that to their own society. So the richest 1% of households have over 3.6 million. And the least wealthy 10% of households have less than £15,000. So you can see the huge division there, the huge inequality at both ends of the spectrum, as you'd expect, really. But it kind of shows where wealth is very much concentrated in the upper end of British society, and what that may do for different arguments that you want to explore, and what that may do for your own notions and preconceptions. Obviously, generally speaking, most people don't realise how much of Britain's wealth is concentrated in the hands of the few, and how much of the elite, if you like, have all of the money and wealth in this country. But again, we need to be very careful not to be biased and look at the facts and look at the reasons for that and what's logical. Now, income is not wealth. Income is what you've got coming in, quite literally. So your monthly salary could be very high, but your outgoings could be incredibly high too. So wealth is kind of what you've got to hand, what's sitting around, if you like, I guess is the easiest way to think of it. Now, if you look here, inequality has increased in the last 10 years of measuring. It's increased by 0.2%, so it's up to 36.3%. So it doesn't sound like a huge increase, but if you think about that as an average over 10 years, and the fact that inequality is a third, if you like, 36%, by the Gini coefficient. So that's, you don't really need to know what that is, but that's a way of working out wealth, income, etc., etc. What's really important is it's the highest level of inequality since 2010, but it has dropped since the huge global crash of 2008. So there's been huge financial shifts, and obviously we've just come through COVID and, you know, the pandemic lockdowns. In the way the economy is functioning now, there's a lot of debate and a lot of arguments about what the true cost of living is going to be like, what the distribution of wealth and inequality is going to look like once it's all been measured and kind of analysed. So we won't really know for a year or two how big an impact some of these changes in the news right now are having. But one thing for your exam and one thing you can talk about is the fact the picture is changing and has been changing consistently over the last decade or so. So that's really useful. The graph you can see there, perhaps a little bit confusing because there's a kind of break in the middle. But the ONS talks about how over that time frame you've got gross income versus disposable income. So disposable income is what people have to spend, what's in their pockets. So you can look at those and see the differences and where the graph's got wider and where it's closed as a gap, and see the trend over time, what's rising and what's not. So think about that in terms of the distribution of income. Think about that in terms of the distribution of wealth too. Now, the last thing you might want to think about is how sociologists explain poverty. Obviously, as we've discussed in class, there's a lot going on in the world right now. There's a lot going on in our society where poverty and the cost of living is in the news and it's in focus. Functionalism would talk about it as a feature, almost a necessary evil, if you like, of social stratification. You know, you need people at the top, people at the bottom, and there's meritocracy available, and it's down to a value consensus. You know, what jobs do we value? What status do we give people? And the fact that people can have social mobility shows that it's out there, and your life chances aren't necessarily the be all and end all. We have to be really careful with that because at GCSE we're talking in very broad strokes here. So functionalists would kind of look at individual explanations of poverty. That person not necessarily has chosen poverty, but hasn't chosen social mobility, perhaps. Compare that with Murray in The New Right and his views on welfare, and you'll see two different takes on individual explanations of poverty. Structural poverty or structural explanations of poverty would be your Marxists and your feminists. So people like Townsend, people like Wolby, they'd be looking at the idea of the inheritance of class, of the fact that this inequality widens over time, and we've just seen proof of that, haven't we? That you've got upper class ideology and upper class control of the media feeding that ideology, alongside patriarchy and alongside glass ceilings, both for gender, ethnicity and class. There's a lot there to unpick in terms of cages for the structural arguments and for the individual arguments. Think about which sociology you want to use for that. Think about what that tells us and make your notes there. Again, if you need anything, please email me, please comment below. I have several other videos which go into a lot more detail about different sociologists and different perspectives, so use those too. These videos are meant to just be a quick overview to get you ready for your exams this year. Again, if you've listened this far, thank you for listening. I hope it's been useful, and best of luck.